Well, okay, let's start here, BC, because yesterday 6 former Huskers were announced to be inducted into the Nebraska Football Hall of Fame in 2023. All deserving of the honor, although it seemed like yesterday was the day to remember Taylor Martinez after he headlined the group. Is there a favorite memory of yours or a favorite moment that you two would like to share that sticks with you whenever you hear the name Taylor Martinez?
There's a few. The 2012 game actually in East Lansing when he was a junior, and that's like my favorite Taylor Martinez game. That's the one where Nebraska was down 10 in the fourth quarter. They rally. He scored on like a long 35-yard touchdown. Well, he had a long like 80-yard run in the first half, but then he had a 35-yarder or something like that in the fourth quarter, and then hits Jamal Turner in the final seconds for Jamal Turner's first Husker touchdown. But in between all that, it's just nutso stuff where like he throws a pick inside the 5-yard line. People might remember that Michigan State ran all the way back, but there was a penalty, so it didn't count for a touchdown. And then he had a play where it was my favorite, like, I guess, encapsulation of Taylor Martinez, where he fumbles the ball. It looks like he might race off for like a 70-yard touchdown, but he fumbles it. It looks like Michigan State might pick it up for a second, but like 3 Spartans miss it, and Taylor Martinez picks up his own fumble and just keeps running forward for about 5 extra yards. That game had all sorts of weird stuff. But 2010, when he jumped on the scene, I was working at the newspaper, and we had caught wind. We had a decent connection with Pelini. And I'll give my cohort at the time, Sip, a lot of credit. We were pretty well tied to Pelini, and we had kind of caught wind that Taylor was going to be the guy that year as a redshirt freshman. And if you take yourself back to that place in time, most people wouldn't say that. They wouldn't believe it. So I remember on shows like this, you'd go on and you'd say, well, I think you got to watch out for Taylor Martinez. And people would be real skeptical of it because Zach Lee was still in the room as a veteran, although I think he had arm problems at that point in his career. And Cody Green was there. And people were still kind of hoping Cody Green was going to take off at Nebraska. But then Bo kind of kept it a secret publicly up until I think it was like when they announced him coming out for the first series. And the crowd, it was just like this buzz, unlike any quarterback announcement I've ever heard in that stadium. Sort of a like anticipation, but also like, who knows what the heck's going to happen? We don't really know anything about this guy. He had redshirted, but he honestly hadn't been written a lot about that first year. And, the third play, 3rd and 1 from the Western Kentucky 46, he fakes it to Roy Halou, and he takes off. And it was just the way he had that burst and separated from everybody. It was one of those oh my moments that you don't get that often in the stadium, but that was one of them, like to really realize this guy's speed and that was going to be a part of the equation. So that memory comes to mind. I also remember he wasn't the best, especially at first behind the mic. And so, he said, like, he does good against road games, or he had some quote that everyone kind of made fun of before they played at Washington. And I remember going up the elevator to the press box for the Nebraska-Washington game that year, and Washington folks were chuckling, like, yeah, let's see, you've played high school road games. Let's see how you handle this environment. And then Nebraska just goes down the field on their first 2 possessions like nobody's business. And Taylor had kind of his coming out party, and then the K-State game a couple weeks later. So 2010 was one of the most fun years I had covering a team, in part because of him. It was a team that probably underachieved a little bit for what they could have done. And you always wonder what would have happened had he not sprained that ankle in the Missouri game. That was a good day for the Huskers, but sort of a bad deal long term with what happened with Taylor. And I think it affected the offense a little bit the rest of the season.
I love playing away games.
Yeah, there you go.
VC, not to just continue down Taylor Martinez memory lane here, but if I
got chills throughout my body.
if I'm remembering right, wasn't it even unclear that he was actually a quarterback when he got recruited? Because he got recruited as an athlete, right? And it wasn't totally clear, at least through a portion of his, I think, redshirt year here, that he was actually going to play quarterback. So that was kind of part of this mystery around him too. It was a very strange situation that I can't really imagine playing out again. Like it just is so bizarre.
Yeah, that's a good point you bring up. For people who weren't following Husker football closely at that point, or they're younger, it definitely was weird, like something you wouldn't see, I think, even now, where you're right. I don't think people even necessarily knew for sure he was a quarterback, or they thought of him as much in the race. I think by the summer, it was clear that he was definitely a guy you should, keep an eye on, but I don't know. Around here, we're sort of trained to think like, well, it's not his turn yet. We kind of think of like when we could talk about position battles on this team and how we maybe have to retrain our mind, especially with this staff. Like, hey, I mean, there are freshman guys who are just going to knock some veterans to the side, and you got to keep in mind that could happen. But at that time, I think because Zach, even though the 2009 year had been a struggle, Zach Lee was still around, and Cody Green, it never quite took off for him like people hoped it would, but you have to put yourself back in that year. And there wasn't enough data yet that wasn't going to work yet.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of people Cody was a great guy, first off, still is. And, 6'4", 220 QB at the time, or whatever he was, he just like looked apart, and you thought, oh, that's the guy. He was so good in front of the media and all that stuff. And then you get this guy who's a little awkward, of course, in front of the cameras, and so am I. But he would say stuff that was quirky and all that, like those quotes you played. But when you watched him run that first year, people didn't know what to do with him. And you can't lose sight of the fact, after that K-State game, the 5th game of the season that year, he was like the biggest thing in college football right then. I mean, he really was nationally. He was like the buzz. I remember ESPN had a sports science show. Do you remember that, where they would show you that was great. And the guy did one specifically on like Taylor Martinez after the K-State game, because he was that much like in people's conversation around the country. Like, who is this dude? So yeah, it obviously didn't kind of finish how you wanted in 2013 and the turf toe. And there's always questions about like what went wrong, why he wasn't really part of that season as much. But he definitely deserves to be a representative in the Nebraska Football Hall of Fame when you look at all his numbers. And I actually tweeted, I kind of made a mistake. I called it the Huskers Hall of Fame the other day. And there is a distinction there. It's the Nebraska Football Hall of Fame, where people have contributed to football to the state of Nebraska. So there's like state college guys and things like that representing that. So people need to kind of be clear on that. But it was cool to see him get in there. And Troy Dumas as well, as a guy I just interviewed a couple weeks ago from the 90s that I was
a good friend of the show.
Yeah, I was just really pumped up for him because he gave his body for this program. He really did. If you hear his stories and like what it did to his body, it beat him up, but he was a guy who could hit like nobody's business.
Ryan,
we won.
I wanted to, you mentioned a little bit there, the kind of the deservingness of Taylor Martinez. I'll be honest, it kind of, the idea of it didn't hit me quite right at first, the idea of Taylor Martinez as a Nebraska Football Hall of Famer. And then you kind of think about it and you remember, I mean, obviously the stats are there, right? Because of how long he played and started, and he was super productive. But it's kind of an odd period in Nebraska football where you kind of always expected more, especially after the way his career started here. More or less after that Kansas State game, a lot of it felt like a disappointment, right? So I think the way I was thinking about Taylor Martinez and kind of the actuality of what happened, especially considering the time since Taylor Martinez, I probably don't remember him as favorably as I should. Is that something you've experienced at all?
Well, I think you're hitting the truth of that era, that there was so many different opinions about, first off, just the head coach, like that, you could draw a line in the sand there. And so then every topic that separated from there, it feels like there were camps, right? You were over here, over there. Like you believed in Taylor was going to take him to the big place, or you didn't. And it is disappointing a little bit in the sense that 2010 was honestly the team we always talk about the 2009 Big 12 title game around here in the second, and I get it. But 2010, man,
they blew the leading Oklahoma, yeah.
Up 17 points on OU. Taylor wasn't quite 100%, but the game started so well.
Mhm.
And if Nebraska wins that game, they would have played UConn, I believe, in the Fiesta Bowl because of the way that it was structured and the Big East had to have someone. And Nebraska would have been a top 5 team, probably in the polls, 12-2, if they beat OU in that game. So that's how close that squad was. But then there was that the transition to the Big Ten, which I think was more difficult for Nebraska than we were imagining going in, and you had to adjust to that. And Taylor was right on the ground floor having to do that. And we were still in that period also where 9 to 10 wins. I mean, right now that seems really good, but at the time it was just like, come on, get over the hump, get to that 11 wins, get into that big bowl game and be a top 5, top 10 team consistently. So there was always something that I think for a good deal of the fan base was a little it felt like something was always left on the table that could have been had. And that, but I do think as time goes on, people look back and be like, yeah, he was a pretty entertaining QB. And you can kind of go back at certain players and you get 5 to 10 years to separate yourself from their careers. And some of the high emotions that carried over from certain games or situations start to drift away a little bit. And you just remember some of the magical plays. And of course, some games that were tough, like Texas A&M on the road when there was a sideline incident in 2010 and all that. So it was definitely a career that always had headlines attached to it that were interesting.
All right, BC, the question coming through the chat room here for you. Who will be the one player on defense, this is from Ken, who has a real nasty streak on the field, if any? A tone setter like Charles Haley, someone who could run C-block.
Boy, that's good. Nasty guy. I don't know if he's going to fit exactly what this question is about, but I'm just going to use it to speak generally about hopes for the D-line and guys who could be difference makers there. And I'm really excited to see what Nash Hutmacher looks like now. I feel like there's enough offseason buzz, and he really took to the strength and conditioning program of Corey Campbell. And, I think the label on him was he was a power guy, of course, who could lift anything, but can he be that guy who has that athleticism and can make plays, east to west and do all that stuff? And it sounds like there's a belief he can, demonstrate more of that in his game this year. And he's been a guy so far who's been kind of what I'd call like a fringe type player. He's important, but he's that 15 to 20 snap a game guy previously. And I think you can see that double and stuff. And he's just one of those players where I think if he can take a couple steps, it changes the picture of how we look at the defense right away, even if we don't know exactly what the scheme looks like when it's game time under Tony White and all that stuff. So he's a guy that, does he have that nasty like edge type that like he's talking about Charles Haley? I'm not sure who I would point the finger on that. But Hutmacher's that guy that I'm really excited about if it can really click for him, because that could be a game changer.
Brian, let's flip it over to the other side of the ball with the offensive line. Our good friend Matt Verzal always talks about kind of the need for that same kind of nastiness and a little bit of a streak on the offensive line. Do you think there's any indications that that's kind of being developed at all? Because I think there's a certain amount of ability on that line, but they're obviously missing something, whether that's schematically or in their mindset. Do you think there's a potential for that sort of attitude to develop on that side of the line?
I think they got some guys who can flip that switch. I think Nuili's a guy like that. Just a great guy to talk to, but I think he loves, like, I still remember when he transferred from Colorado State in the interview, I had a lot of fun. He's one of those guys who he's like, I love football and I think people will take this the right way. The quote was basically like, it's a way to be violent and it's legal, like to hit someone and just really enjoy that. And I love hearing that whenever a guy in the trenches is coming up and talks like that. And so I think he's got that in him. And it really hurt him, as he shared with us in the spring when he met the media, how much, it cost him and the squad to be out last season with the suspension. So I think he's got a lot of pent up stuff that's going to come out in his play. So he'd be somebody I point to, but it's an interesting dynamic with the O-line because there's positive momentum because of all the stuff that's been said about Donovan Raiola from Matt Rule and how the coaches believe in him. And then there's been some good recruiting, obviously, there with Preston Tamua, this last week, adding to that. So I think it has changed the narrative a bit, but I think where it's put the narrative right now is people are like, okay, I have an open mind now. Let's see what you got. It's not necessarily that people are just going to believe everything they hear in the fall camp about this O-line, but they're going to be like, I'm going to give them a shot because I do understand the points of, last year would have been tough for any assistant coach with the offense they were running and all the turmoil in the program than to have a lot of success in what you're doing. So I think there is people who are saying, well, all right, let's see what he's really about as a coach now, because last year probably wasn't the best example.
BC, we're talking to Brian Christopherson, senior writer at Husker 24/7. BC, what's the big difference about the hype this time around with Rule versus Frost when it comes to their first recruiting class?
Well, I mean, it's got to be proven that this class is a hit too, because your question's a good one, Andrew, because we could say this every time this year. You can look at stuff on paper, and Nebraska's always been pretty good on paper recruiting wise. It's just been like, can you really develop those players? And, can you get the 4 stars to play like 4 stars? You could start there, like a guy like Bryce Benhart's a guy who is a big time recruit and it's sort of stayed in place. And now you're seeing like, let's see what a new staff can do with him. Maybe they do take him to another place. So if you see some of those older guys start to pop a little bit where you're like, yeah, that guy looks a little different to me this season, and it's not the same old, that would give you a lot of encouragement, I think, about the younger players who maybe you don't even see as much. And also, I just think, you saw a little bit of a taste of it even in the spring game. Frankly, Cam Lenhart and Prince Will, even then, and I know I'm the first to say, don't make too much of that scrimmage, but those guys look better than most true freshmen that walk around here that have come through this program already when you just saw them practice and stuff like that. And to see them out there with the ones and flashing the way they were, obviously they're going to have their growing pains. But those guys were 2 examples from this class that are already right in front of your eyes who you're like, man, they look pretty good. I'll take my chances with them. So I think that adds to the optimism that there's really something there. And also the data points, I think, established through Rule and Evan Cooper working, Evan Cooper just identifying guys, believing in the way they recruit and the way they look at traits and how that has played out for him at Baylor and Temple. I think that past success is making people think, well, maybe there's a shot that it can really happen here, because they have a little bit more proof probably than the last group did.
Brian, I tend to agree with you that the reasons for optimism are probably on the defensive side of the ball, especially. I'm excited about that defensive line kind of for the reason you talked about. If you wanted to find some optimism on the offensive side of the ball, are you looking at the offensive line kind of like you were talking about, where they might be able to start performing like the recruits that they were? Or is there a place that you're looking at offensively that you could maybe see some light at the end of the tunnel there?
Yeah, I would start with the O-line and the belief that they can and probably will be better to some degree. Now, how far that goes, I just think the mindset from what we've heard, it might be a little bit more of an old school attack, from this Nebraska offense. And I think people are going to have patience. I don't think it's going to be easy right away. Damon, I know, stresses this every week on the show. He really talks about the defense a lot, and that having to be portable, especially early in the year while this offense kind of finds itself. And I sort of envision, and I'm wrong a lot, so probably will be this time, but I think, some of those early games, people might have to settle in for some old-fashioned Big Ten football where you have the type of offense where let's say you start a drive on the 25, but you get a couple first downs, you take 3 or 4 minutes off the clock. It's not just a 60-second possession where you give it right back and you're going to lose time of possession by 12 minutes by the end of the game. but you maybe get 2 first downs, you get to midfield and it stalls out, but you punt and you play that sort of Big Ten game, where you rely on your defense to keep field position sort of tilted your way. I could see that being a formula early on in the season if this team's going to have success. Not that there won't be some nice drives too that they finish off, but I do think, just kind of reading between the lines with this offense and the way they've talked about it, I could see it being more Husker old school, where it's like, have a little patience in the first and second quarter if some of those drives aren't going all the way, and hope that you're kind of leaning on them, and by the fourth quarter it has an effect like it used to, not 1995 style, but like where you maybe 2010 style, where that group sometimes had a way of finishing people off in the fourth quarter. So hopefully they can start to get back more to that.
BC, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks so much. We'll talk again next week.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Happy Wednesday. That is
Yep.
Brian Christopherson, senior writer at Husker 24/7.